Okay, we're going to get started. How's that sound? Is everyone excited to be here? If you're excited, raise your hand. Well, some people didn't raise their hand. Some people are forced to be here. So hi, everyone. Okay, you're raising your hand retroactive. Okay, yes, okay, I'm glad. So hi, all. I have the honor of opening up this session. I'll move this up slightly. And welcoming you here. So welcome, everyone. So this session is about power and participation in philanthropy. And so this is a conversation that's inextricably tied to human rights. So we're all participatory grant makers up here. And as we lay out, and that actually influences how we're laying out the session. And so as participatory grant makers, we want to share information, but we actually want a lot more of your experience to come into the room and kind of guide our discussion and conversation. So just to give a quick rundown of our time together, we're going to be starting by asking folks to bring in your beliefs and wisdom related to participatory practices. Then we're going to move into some definitions, frameworks, and examples of what exactly is participatory grant making and why the focus on participatory grant making. And then we're going to end with a good amount of time to contextualize your all experiences within participatory approaches. And open up for more of a back and forth dialogue between you all and us, all combinations of those people. Does that sound reasonable to folks? Yes. Okay. So before we get into the participation portion, we just want to give a quick introduction to ourselves. We'll actually give more information about our organization and our work later, but for right now, we'll just do introductions. My name is Allistair Mallillin. I'm a senior program officer at Counsel Foundation. We're based in Oakland, California, and I use the he, him series of pronouns.
Hi, my name is Diana Samarasan, and I'm the founding executive director of two sister organizations, global grant makers, called the Disability Rights Fund and the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund, which support disability movements in Africa, Asia, Pacific, and Caribbean. And we're based in Boston, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katy Love, and until recently, I served as the director of the grant-making team of the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit that runs Wikipedia based in San Francisco, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so now we want to get a sense of you so that we can understand where you're coming from and engage with your beliefs in a more direct way rather than trying to read your minds, which I'm not very good at. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand or any appendage and signal to us that you agree with the statement if you do. If you don't agree with it, please just keep all appendages where they are. So please move to the next slide. All right, please raise your hand if you agree with the statement. Money in the form of philanthropy can be used to address human rights issues in the world. Raise your hand if you agree. Okay. Thank you. I would like to ask for one of you to share why you raised your hand for that. Someone to be brave to just share a brief sentence about their choice. Yes?
Many times governments fall short in funding and accounting for human rights issues, and so when people step in and provide voluntary assistance, that's a very important way to kind of fill those gaps.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that. All right, next slide, please. People with wealth should be able to decide where their money goes, what issues receive support, who gets their money, how that money is spent, etc. Raise your hand if you agree with this statement. So we have one person who agrees. Would you be willing to share?
Several.
Or two? Okay, people I can't see. Would one of you be willing to share why you raised your hand?
Absolutely. Well, I kind of have an issue with the word wealth. I don't know how that's conceptually defined, but with the wealth that I do have, I like to donate to nonprofits of my choice.
Yep.
And I like that.
Yep. Wonderful. Next.
I want to ask somebody who didn't have their hand.
Well, that's the next slide, Diana. We thought of that.
Foreboding.
Please raise your hand if you agree that people who are affected by money should decide where the money goes. And here we're talking about human rights issues. Okay? A lot of folks. Would someone share why they raised their hand? Why do you agree?
I think the people that are affected by the money should have say in how it affects their lives. If there's an issue that's being addressed, they need to have a seat at the table to help construct the right solution.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Solutions to human rights problems are best defined by experts. And here, experts we're thinking about perhaps some people like us who are in the room here, who are studying human rights issues, who have expertise in institutions that address human rights issues. Raise your hand if you agree with this. Oh, I'm kind of surprised. No one agrees. Maybe it's a self-selecting audience here. All right, let's move to the next one. Solutions to human rights problems are best defined by those experiencing the problems. All right. Seems a lot of people agree with this one. Anyone want to share a thought? Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. In philanthropy, the outcomes or goals are most important, independent of how they happen. For instance, it's more important to eradicate hunger than how you actually eradicate hunger. Raise your hand if you agree. You look confused. Is that just thinking about it? Thank you. Thank you for engaging. All right, perhaps no one agrees with this, which tells us a lot about the people in the room, I think.
Yeah.
Next slide, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much for sharing your thinking. These are hard questions, and there's lots of gray areas about participation, process versus goal, and I enjoyed hearing your responses. As human rights practitioners and scholars, you know a lot about this slide, which outlines the connection between human rights principles and human rights philanthropy. So what is human rights philanthropy? And first, what kind of scope are we talking about? What kind of money are we talking about? What is the scope of human rights philanthropy? Well, it's not very big, actually. There is no comprehensive study on how much private money, foundation money, is actually being given globally each year from around the world. But estimates say it's about $400 billion. The Human Rights Foundation, the Human Rights Funders Network, and the U.S. Foundation Center, which is now Candid, in 2016 did a study of global giving addressing human rights, and found that the total amount going to human rights from foundations was about $3 billion. So that would make it less than 1% of total global giving. And if you add bilateral and multilateral funding into that is addressing rights, that brings it up another $4 billion for a total of $7 billion globally, which is still less than 2% of global giving. That means, less than $1 each for each of the more than 7 billion people on the planet. So obviously we need more focus on human rights in philanthropy. But what we're here to talk to you about is how. First, I want to give a definition of human rights philanthropy that also comes from the Human Rights Funders Network and is on the screen. And this definition is that human rights philanthropy empowers individuals, communities, and institutions to promote the protection and enforcement of rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights treaties. They go on to say that human rights grantmaking has a special focus on or duty to support the efforts of disadvantaged or marginalized populations, and that a grant or grants program is defined as human rights funding if it seeks systemic change in the implementation of rights. Principles of human rights funders, which are aligned with general human rights principles, include universality, that human rights apply to everyone, but there's a gap when it comes to certain populations, so human rights philanthropy seeks to address these gaps. Accountability. Human rights philanthropy seeks systemic change, so institutions are accountable to people. Non-discrimination. Human rights philanthropy promotes protection and enjoyment of rights without discrimination. Transparency. Information on human rights philanthropy is available to public scrutiny. There are some issues with that around security of information, security of people doing the work, but still. Participation. As one human rights funder said, putting the human rights of people we're trying to support at the center of our programming. And then a focus on marginalized groups. However, there's often a disconnect between philanthropy and human rights, and this has to do with the process of grant giving and the culture of human rights donors. And that word, participation, the putting the human rights of people at the center of our programming. Too often, human rights donors are focused on outcome and ends, and not on the means of getting there. There is little internal scrutiny. Who's making decisions about strategy, about grants, about where the money is going, how are the decisions made, and what values or principles are being used to make them. So I'm going to pass back to Katy for an overview of, on a global scale, a relatively new form of grant making that, as Allistair said, we all practice, which is participatory grant making, so that she can explain to you what it is. What are we talking about?
Well, here is a basic definition to kind of get us on the same page. Participatory grant-making cedes decision-making power about grant funding to the communities a foundation aims to serve. That definition comes from a resource that we will share with you at the end from a grant craft tool, which is a tool that a lot of funders and foundations use to learn best practice in philanthropy. So this is the definition that we're starting with. This model flips traditional philanthropy on its head. Instead of relying on the wisdom and expertise of experts and paid staff and giving power to those with wealth, it flips it on its head and challenges us to invite those who are most marginalized, who have the lived experience of injustice, in to own the decisions about how that money is spent. Next slide. Oh boy, I cannot read this from here. But this is a beautiful image that I think really illustrates how the values and the ethos and the process are intertwined. Again, you'll hear us talk a lot about process. The process matters. It matters significantly. How we show up, how we engage, who is there to engage, how we learn about it. It's a continuously iterative process that stems from critical values that we'll talk about a little bit more later.
Did folks need that picture again?
It's in the grant craft resource that we'll share at the end.
Hard selling this resource.
It's great.
So before I go into the why participatory approaches now, I'm just trying to get a sense of folks in the room. Who was familiar with philanthropy before walking into this room? Okay. And then are folks engaged in other types of participatory practices as well? Yeah. Okay, cool. Just getting a sense. So what's up here is a short reasoning for why participatory approaches now. I'm wondering if I could get some folks to read out what it is, because it might be a little too far from it for everyone. So audience participation.
Rising inequality in income, power, politics, waning trust in traditional institutions, people power is on the rise,
Thank you. Could I get someone else to read some of them?
Organizations are being pressured to change, less hierarchy, more collaboration. New generations are embracing transparency, co-creation, and collaboration. And problems are too complex for actors to solve alone.
Cool. Do these resonate with folks? Some folks didn't nod their heads. So we will explain more. What I'll say is that participatory grant making became necessary and popularized because of what's happening in the market economy, which is creating winners and creating losers. And income inequality, or inequality in all forms, is skyrocketing. Income inequality, for example, is the highest levels that it's been at since right before the Great Depression. Wealth inequality, so income inequality being the amount of income that you earn in a year, and wealth being the aggregate of all the pluses and minuses in a year and all the assets that you own. Wealth inequality is also skyrocketing. The top 1%, or the top 10% of society owns about 80% of all the wealth in the US, and that's about compared to the bottom 50% who have 1% of the wealth in the society. Right? And the reason that this is important is that the divide between the haves and the have-nots continues to grow. Right? Power and decision-making power is more and more getting concentrated in the hands of the few instead of the hands of the many, and that's one of the reasons for participatory approaches. And so within this slide, I want to lift up that inequality piece, but then I also want to lift up the bottom around the problems are too complex for actors to solve alone. And so within that, our belief is that diversity of perspective creates a diversity of solutions. And so long-standing, intractable, long-term chronic problems are not going to be addressed by simple market rate solutions. It's going to take a long, complex, diverse array of opinions in order to get solutions that are just as complex as the issues we're trying to face. And the other thing, nope, that is all the things. And so these are participatory approaches. We're talking about it in the context of participatory grant making. Can folks raise their hands and share maybe other types of participatory practices that they're engaged with?
Participatory action research.
Mm-hmm. They see it, Matt.
An anti-human trafficking coalition for the community.
Awesome.
Participatory democratic decision making.
Great.
Nice.
Yeah.
In Oaxaca, Mexico, there's a form of governance that has autonomy and is organized around everyday participatory decision making.
That's awesome. Yeah, and so I guess the end concept here is participatory practices are, we try to incorporate them in many sectors and in most sectors. So there's participatory grant making, which we're talking about in the context of philanthropy. There's also participatory budgeting, democracy, participatory planning, participatory action research. Lots of, the list goes on and on and on and on. I'll stop there.
All right, so we're going to move on to give you some more information about who we are and what we do as examples of participatory grant making in practice. And I'm going to begin. I'm as I said at the beginning, the founding ED of the Disability Rights Fund. And one of our key values, because human rights work is often, and you'll excuse my terminology here, just so damn hard, one of our values is celebration. And on that note, the Disability Rights Fund hit a milestone last year. We celebrated our 10-year anniversary. So, woo! Back 11 or 12 years ago in 2007, when we were building the framework for the fund, that was just following the adoption of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was adopted at the end of 2006. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, for the first time explicitly recognized that persons with disabilities are rights holders. This is 2006. And that persons with disabilities are human beings covered by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and all other human rights treaties in the same way as anyone else. Well, why did this matter? It mattered not only because this is the 21st century, and we should be recognizing each other for the beautiful, diverse, equal human beings we are. And it mattered not only because human rights are indivisible and universal and everyone should live a life of dignity, but it mattered also because of the scope of the population of persons with disabilities. Even though I bet each one of you knows someone with a disability, and I want you to take a moment to think about that. Whether they are somebody with a physical disability, a sensory disability, an intellectual disability, a psychosocial disability, a visible or an invisible disability. And even though we all hope to age and probably acquire some disabilities along that path, people actually don't know data about disability. Of the more than 7 billion humans on this planet, 1 billion are persons with disabilities. 1 billion. That's 1 in 7. 1 in every 7 of us are people with disabilities. And among women, because of the connections between poverty and disability, it's 1 in 5. 1 in 5 women are women with disabilities. Up until the advent of the CRPD, persons with disabilities were not seen as full rights holders. They were treated, including by donors, as end objects for charity, services, rehabilitation, medical intervention, as passive recipients, not as active, empowered participants in their own lives, decision makers. This is why the global disability community slogan is, "Nothing about us without us." So we built the Disability Rights Fund on the mandate for participation of persons with disabilities in the achievement of rights. And this was important not only to turn paradigms about disability on their head, but important because donors knew so little about disability rights movements. They didn't know what the priorities of these movements were, what kinds of organizations existed, where they were, how to make grant application processes accessible to a variety of people with different impairments. So when we built the framework for the fund, we ensured that in our bylaws, we require our board to be 50% or more persons with disabilities, that our grant-making committee is a majority persons with disabilities from around the world, that the majority of our staff and our program officers are persons with disabilities. And this wasn't only the right thing to do, it was the smart thing to do. Because who knows better about how to make grant-making accessible to a variety of people with different impairments than persons with disabilities themselves? Who knows the priorities of the movement and what supports are needed better than persons with disabilities themselves? So we operate on a set of principles and values which align with the general principles stated in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And these are things like respect for inherent dignity and individual autonomy, non-discrimination, full and effective participation, equality of opportunity, accessibility, etc. And I will speak more to those later. I'll give my colleagues a chance to describe their processes.
Oh, I'm next. So I work at Common Counsel Foundation. We're a 30-plus-year-old public foundation that has two main things that we do. We essentially support small family foundations and donor-advised funds, or individual donors. And so that's one portion of our work. And then on the other side of it, we host grant-making initiatives where traditional philanthropy is not playing a key role. And so with my time, I want to talk mainly around these grant-making initiatives because that's the most important thing in the context of this conversation. And I'll say that both of these programs that I'm highlighting here were created because of the gaps within traditional philanthropy and trying to figure out for Native communities and folks who are suffering from displacement and gentrification issues, what are the solutions that actually they want to advance and actually could potentially work on these big complex issues. And so I put some details and logistics of it there, but at a high level, I actually just want to talk about why these two funds were created. So for Native Voices Rising, which is the fund on your left, which focuses on Native-led advocacy efforts, it was created because in traditional philanthropy, philanthropy was not funding any Native work. If you look at grant-making dollars that were going out, less than 0.5% of philanthropic money and grant funds were actually going out to benefit Native communities. And what I'll say about that is that the money that was going out largely was going to museums, to hospitals, and to higher education institutions, which in many times are actually just tokenizing the experiences of Native communities and are not actually advancing solutions that could empower, support, uplift Native communities themselves. And so we created this fund, Native Voices Rising, essentially to build traction within mainstream funders to try and figure out what is it that if Native communities had the power to make decisions, grant-making decisions for themselves, where would they want to put the money? So that's our NVR program. On the right, and I use a lot of acronyms, so stop me. But on the right, on your right, is our Fund for Inclusive California, and that's a newer fund for us. That's about a $12 million fund over the next 3 years, which is very small compared to housing and displacement issues within California. I'll say that as a blanket statement. And so for our Fund for Inclusive California, which focuses on displacement and housing issues in 5 different regions within California, that was essentially created because the solution that was being proffered by a lot of folks was essentially that if we created more market rate units, housing and displacement and gentrification would stop. For our folks on the ground, and you'll see here that we had 14 community leaders who are actually co-designing, co-creating, and co-recommending grants with us, that those folks actually, those who are experiencing housing, experiencing displacement, experiencing gentrification, that those solutions didn't work for them. And so we essentially brought them in and said, what would it look like if you were the one that were actually trying to solve this issue of housing and gentrification? So thinking about not only development strategies for affordable housing and market rate units, but also thinking about local and state policy efforts, and then thinking about what are the collaborations that we have to build outside of the housing justice movement in order to actually move an agenda for housing justice. Those are all the things that I'm saying.
Well, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Wikimedia Foundation, which again is the nonprofit organization that runs Wikipedia. And the mission of the Wikimedia Foundation goes beyond Wikipedia. The mission is to create, to have all of the world's knowledge freely available to all humans. So that's a big, very challenging mission, but it's an important one. And we use a tool of grant making, of moving money around the world in order to help achieve that mission. So the way that we developed our programs is absolutely in sync with the principles behind Wikipedia. Wikipedia just being the world's 5th or 6th largest website and a beloved website. I can't quite see from there, so I'll have to look at my notes to go in the right order. But transparency is an important value, both in Wikipedia and in the grant making of the foundation. Transparency in Wikipedia, you may or may not know, but every contribution, every edit, every discussion is logged online and associated either with a user account or an IP address. Transparency, we believe, is critical to ensuring high quality and having some accountability. So similarly, in the grants programs, every proposal that comes in, Every question that's asked, every conversation between the applicant and the committee members or the staff members is on the website, and anyone can see them. We believe it's important to not only share the proposals, but also the decisions about how $7 or $8 million is spent every year. That's money that donors like you and me are contributing to Wikipedia, $5, $10, $20. People are contributing this money, and so we believe transparency is important. Participation is equally important. Wikipedia, as you know, is not created by one individual. It's created by tens of thousands of active individuals and millions of people beyond that who contribute. So participation is an important process as well, where we invite everyone from around the world to share feedback, to ask questions. These are your dollars too, and your rupees and your shekels. All of the monies that we collect for Wikipedia are shared resources. So we invite participation, and people do engage. People from around the world ask questions about the proposals. They ask questions about our decisions. They share proposals that they like. They let you know when they like things and when they don't, and we really value that. Shared power is another important tenet. And we believe, again, as these are shared resources, that it's not fair for any one individual or for an institution, the Wikimedia Foundation, to make decisions about these grant funds. We devolve power to the communities who create this beloved resource and treasure. It's important for them to be involved. So in that way, the people you'll see on the screen are representatives from one of the grant-making committees that we run. And I really love seeing their faces every time. It reminds me of the people behind the process. They are ultimately responsible for making the decisions, not the paid staff, of which I was one. Accountability, we have a few ways of holding ourselves accountable. One is through the representation, of course, of people from the communities we seek to serve. But also, we're continuously learning about this process. After we run grant rounds, we ask participants if they're willing to share some thoughts with us. And I've been very, very grateful and impressed by the kinds of information we've collected through surveys, through feedback, and of course, like everything, we share that learning online, and we make changes accordingly. It's an iterative process, as you participatory experts know. There is no perfect status. It's a constant evolution and learning process. We also have some mechanisms where grants applicants can challenge the decisions. That was an important part of the design. We have a complaints process and an appeals process. If you don't like the decision of the grant, there is a mechanism to challenge that. Those have been interesting to trial, and I'd be happy to share more, but those are a few of the mechanisms that we use for accountability. And then finally, diversity. How can we have all of the world's knowledge freely available for all people if we don't have more than just a handful of people from San Francisco making decisions about funds? So diversity was a key component here for us. We noticed that what happened originally when we were setting things up is the people who tended to opt in, to raise their hands to participate, tended to be the people who are overrepresented on Wikipedia, which means, for the most part, cisgendered men from North America and Europe were highly represented. We ran some elections even, thinking this will be a great way to kind of get people's voices in there, but who wins elections? It's white cisgendered men from North America and Europe. So we had to rejigger our processes entirely and think about how we were ensuring that people from diverse backgrounds, from a variety of genders, from a variety of languages, from a variety of countries, were having access to this process, and how we could make it a good process for them, how we could ensure that they felt it was a valuable experience for them. Because funders traditionally have been quite extractive. You all submit proposals to us, you might spend hundreds of hours doing that, we'll decide. If you don't get any funding, well, that's, we're sorry about this. So we really do want to ensure that there is more diversity in the decision making, because we believe it leads to better outputs, better processes, and better outcomes overall.
Cool. That was an overview of our three organizations. Before I get into this slide, I want to ask if there's clarifying questions for folks while it's fresh in mind. Because we're really good on time.
With the data that you all collect with Wikimedia, do you sell that data?
Oh, no. The Wikimedia Foundation is very, very, very careful about not tracking data. Only certain data are collected. And there's a very beautiful privacy policy that's generated actually with members of our community who set that policy with the legal team. No, we do not sell. I'm actually no longer an employee of the foundation. I left just a few months ago, and now I work as an independent consultant advancing this practice. But the Wikimedia Foundation is very committed to not selling things, to not selling data, to not having advertisements, and it's one of the most amazing things about a very popular website that's learned to generate income through other means of participation. So no data is sold.
I realized that. I was actually sort of setting up the point, which is that this does seem to be an interesting model in a global economy that's focused on the commodification of knowledge. And I'm wondering, sociologist Eric Olin Wright that held up Wikipedia, he actually used, but I guess Wikimedia would be more appropriate, as a real utopia, really existing utopia, essentially almost a socialist institution, he would call that lovingly. Okay, I'll try to talk loud. And yet, the challenges, obviously, that you must face as a consultant trying to spread these principles must be great. And I'm wondering if before we're through today, you might be able to tell us about some of those points of tension that you face, specifically around efforts to, I don't know if it's decommodify knowledge, but to create institutions that aren't commodifying knowledge, and what you think the chances of survival and spread are. Wikimedia is a very special institution, I think.
It is. It's such a beautiful thing. Truly, when I pause to think about Wikipedia, I start feeling teary-eyed. It's this amazing gift to humanity from humanity, and it's based on these principles that are very inherent to the work we do in participatory approaches. I think the Wikimedia Foundation is experiencing those tensions all the time, too. I think it's fair to say that the tensions I mentioned around representation are faced on Wikipedia on a daily basis by contributors, that in order to have all of the world's knowledge actually in a freely available way that doesn't commodify it, we actually have to change some of the tensions we face in society that are represented on the internet. So for instance, being a person who doesn't identify as a man, tends to be a more negative experience to have. And a lot of research has been done about why it is that's women and other non-binary people don't generally participate in Wikipedia and other sites like that. I think that overall, though, why Wikipedia is so successful is an indication of the larger work we're trying to do here. It's an indication of these larger trends, of these rising people power movements, of these challenges to large institutions. These are gaining traction. At the same time, we're seeing the exact opposite trend. I love the poster out there that someone did around all the data that's being sold, that we're all using these little handy devices, and yet we're being tracked and our data's being sold, and we know that we have very few rights in the digital space. Wikipedia remains an outlier in that space, but ultimately I do believe that as we trend more and more, hopefully, in the direction of where we'd like to go, that it will not be the only institution, the only website that's like this, that it will actually continue to be a part of a diversity.
Cool. Yeah, I shouldn't have opened that door because that was not a clarifying question. Okay, but I do hear this want for discussion, and so I guess let me wrap up here, and then we're going to try and get into discussion and Q&A portion with folks. Yeah, I guess I'll say that for this slide, traditional philanthropy, I would say, has been characterized largely by Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. And in it, he essentially posits, one, those who are successful in the market economy should be as successful as possible because it is their responsibility, number two, to actually give away as much money as possible. And so that was his major premise. And so I have two major points around that. One is that actually the underlying premise in what he's saying there is that those who are winners in the market economy are the ones who should be making decisions for everybody else in the economy. I have problems with that. I think folks up here have problems with that. And here's where this quotation comes in. around justice demanding universal participation. And then for participatory practices, there's a belief that every person, every perspective, every viewpoint actually has value and is meaningful, and that it's those collective decisions or collective perspectives together that actually will draw us to solutions that are just as complex and effective as anything else. Right? And again, I'll reiterate that to solve complex, intractable problems, we believe that you need to have a diverse set of opinions and perspectives that are just as complex as the solutions that or issues that we're trying to face. The second thing that I want to pull out of Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth is essentially that he's saying that inequality is inevitable. Inequality in his framing is essentially a transitionary stage between folks accruing a lot of wealth and giving away a lot of wealth. And in between that, you're holding a lot of wealth. So I want to say that his belief is that it's inevitable and that it's transient, meaning it's a very small portion of the time that inequality is happening. I would probably say that is not true, given where current economy and system is right now. And what Anand talks about in his book, the Winners Take All book, is essentially one of the issues that we're grappling with here. He says that poverty as an idea can be fixed with charity, because the more money you give, the more poverty you can alleviate and reduce. Inequality cannot be solved with money directly. Inequality is actually a driver and result of the process that's actually allowing folks to accrue a lot of money and those who are losing in the system to not accrue a lot of money. And in order to change inequality, you actually have to change and address the system. So that all sucks. And so I guess for us in this space, they didn't see my talking points before. For us in this space, what is the opportunity, as Anand talks about? What is the opportunity to change the system and shift the power? Right? And so in our belief, participatory practices and participatory grant making in the context of philanthropy is one of those key components in terms of how are we democratizing, how are we devolving power, how are we shifting power into those who are most impacted by issues.
Can I add one point here?
Yes.
Just to say, I think it's really important to notice, again, that this is a growing trend at the moment, and a lot of funders are perking up and are getting really interested in this. The values resonate with them, and we are starting to see more and more, even of the larger, what we call traditional funders, support these approaches, be intrigued by these approaches, et cetera. So I think it is important to note, to the question we got earlier, that actually this is part of a larger trend and a larger moment where everyone who is in philanthropy is starting to hear these questions, if not grapple with these questions themselves and think about how they can address them. There is a tide shift happening in philanthropy undeniably right now. It's starting to happen all over the world, actually. In many continents, there are funds developing that are either changing their approach or adopting these approaches, but it's actually a pretty widespread practice, and that is only increasing right now, which is exciting.
Could you unpack, or do we need to move forward?
Go. Yeah.
Could you unpack that conversion process a little bit? Talking about how these more traditional grant funders, like the ethical decision-making process, the psychological process, what arguments you guys are using, because that I find really interesting.
Yeah. Actually, it's a really interesting question because there are those like the Wikimedia, Common Councils, the DRF, Disability Rights Fund, that started this way, that participation was always a given. And most of the funds that we're seeing are starting with these values. Actually, your question, I think, is very intriguing about how some of the more established, traditional, hierarchical funders are making this conversion or engaging in this practice. Do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Katy. So they are asking questions. They're asking good questions. They're looking for ways that they might invite more participation into their processes. Some of them, like Ford Foundation, are putting money into research about participatory grant making, actually publishing information about participatory grant making, and looking at, how can we convince our trustees? So what kind of information do we need on the impact of participatory grant making, maybe versus traditional philanthropy, to bring to the people at the top to maybe start this process. We, and Katy and I are, and Allistair might be, but we don't know yet, a part of a very new participatory grant-making collective, in which we, not only us, but others as well who have been doing participatory grant-making for decades now, are writing about participatory grant-making, are presenting about it. Just last week, we were in New York presenting to the Open Society Foundation's, their grant-making support group about participatory grant-making, and are starting to think through what some of the next steps might be to bring these practices into more traditional philanthropy. One of the ideas we have that we are just looking for some time and money to get together to figure out how to actually actualize is to create a participatory audit framework, which would enable us to go into a larger foundation like Ford or Open Society and do an audit. That would be the first step towards saying, okay, here are the various levels in which you could, where you don't currently have participation, and where participation might make sense, and how you might get there, and then to do a mentoring process towards enabling participation. And we're thinking big picture there, so not only participation in the grant-making decisions or the strategy setting, but also foundations have a lot of money on hold in endowments, invested. What is it invested in? Who's making those decisions? Is the community, is there any community involvement in that decision making about investments of those resources that are supposed to be going for the good of the community? So there are a lot of different levels at which participation can be questioned, could be incorporated, and a lot of this is at the very start.
So what I would add, and to take a step back, I would say traditional philanthropy was set up in many ways like as a tax shelter for folks. Like, we are making a lot of money in whatever sector, and our job is, as Andrew Carnegie says, to give away money, and we get a tax write-off for that. And so philanthropy as an institution was set up essentially around risk mitigation. And so what that traditionally leads to in philanthropy is you're funding bigger organizations who have minimal chance of defaulting, essentially. And so participatory grant making is a very different way of looking at things, in saying that folks who traditionally don't have access to resources actually should be out front making decisions, and will empower and provide skills and all this stuff so that those folks actually feel empowered and supported to make those decisions. And so I think why I say that, because when we talk about like open societies or Ford Foundation or all these big legacy foundations, they have hundreds of millions or $1 billion in assets.
Billions and billions.
Our foundations are very different. The scale of grant making and common council is $6 million. Wikimedia, Katy presented as 7 to 8. Disabilities Rights Fund is
About $2.5 million.
$2.5 million. And so I say that because as smaller foundations in the foundation world, we are allowed to act a little bit more left of center, or a little bit more progressive in terms of how we're trying to advance theories of changes. And for larger foundations, what you'll see in the adoption of these practices are that it's largely smaller organizations or smaller philanthropies and funders who are adopting these. And for those bigger foundations, you're actually going to see it more piece by piece. And so I think your question is like spot on. Like, how do we actually, for these bigger foundations, how do we writ large, get them to shift instead of piece by piece, which actually, in many ways, is behooving to the whims of particular individuals instead of an institution.
But
And-
no.
Okay, so, but I think that we are in a good moment to press for those changes because of things like Epstein and the money given to MIT or Harvard or wherever else, and the information that is coming out about, you know, why did you take this money?
Right.
Who was overseeing the taking of that money and the using of that money? And why wasn't the public informed? And also the Sacklers, who were behind the opioid crisis. Again, you know, many of the art institutions that their money went to are beginning to think, well, we need a different way forward because we can't have this happen again. It's not just money. It comes with all the background of how the money got to those people.
And I wanted to add one thing about how I would approach trustees. This is truly one of my life ambitions, to see this practice adopted much more broadly, and have spent a lot of time talking to tens or hundreds of people about how this can happen. And I think that there's both the push and the pull. There's simultaneously pushes and then also the pulls that we're trying to show how it's more effective. And the two major arguments that we often speak about are justice and effectiveness. So philanthropy is traditionally about charity, but we're trying to encourage people to think about it as justice, to reorient ourselves towards justice rather than just as charity. So we believe, again, that it is an issue of righteousness and justice for people whose lived experience is affected by those grant dollars. It is just for them to have that decision-making power. And then we also think that it's effective. We think it's much more effective. Diana spoke about that earlier. It's more effective to invite decision-making from those who are affected by the issues. And there have been a lot of pieces written about this and more research forthcoming about this, because we have found that many traditional philanthropists want data. They want to see the numbers of why is this more effective. And to that we say, show us the data that says traditional approaches are effective. Where is that data? So that's a really good question for all of us to push back when we hear the challenge about, isn't this more timely? Isn't it more costly? Isn't the process too heavy? We ask those questions in reverse.
And on that note, is the process too heavy? Well, the meat is in the process. That
Or
is,
the tempeh.
or the tempeh, yeah. Because what we truly believe is that the process is a part of the outcome. It's a very important part of the outcome. And I think, you know, we're beginning to wake up in a lot of democracies around the world and realize that, oh, we thought democracy was an outcome, and we were fine, and we didn't have to do the process. Well, actually, we do have to do the process. You know, all of us have to be involved in the process all the time. Yeah, it's a little tiring, but that's it. We've got to do it. It's like an infinity loop. You can't let go of that process because that is where the tempeh is.
Cool.
Let's
so
pass it back.
I see questions. Wondering how folks, transparent facilitation, wondering if folks want to go to questions or if you want to do small groups.
Let's do some questions first, and then maybe the small group.
So I saw 1, 2.
So I'm sorry I came late. I was confused with the session, so I went to a wrong one. I'm really sorry.
That's okay. Welcome.
So I catch something that you said when I was entering. That's why I say this. Maybe I didn't understand you well. So you said that giving a lot of money can alleviate poverty, but not inequality. I think even giving a lot of money doesn't alleviate poverty at all. really. So really, it's a serious problem. So, and that's why I believe in participatory process. And so my question is, so I'm trying to write a dissertation on participation of women in the context of conflict in global South Africa. And so I'm struggling with the process, you know. So something that we can say, this more or less should be the step, you know, to bring women actually to be involved in those decision making that are impacting, or those who are funding, or just the government who are just taking any decision without even caring about those people, right? So do you have an idea already, you know, so that I can understand that you are working on these issues? So do you have an idea about those steps, that these are the steps to make those people who are concerned by the issue participate in decision-making processes? Thank you.
I would say it's one of my favorite topics of conversation, that participatory decision-making, just the logistics, how you do it, how do you address bias, how do you ensure representation, how do you deal with power dynamics. That is the bread and butter of the conversations that we have as practitioners. We love understanding new models, how do you actually serve as a facilitator in an engaging way, et cetera. And I think that is, there's a whole bunch of tools I would love to share with you, including my favorite, which is called The Guide to Participatory Decision Making, which is a book written by Sam Kainer and colleagues, and is just a fabulous framework and offers you so many tools for how to get there. But I think you might be asking a more general question around how you ensure involvement and respect of that involvement. And one thing that we've been thinking about a lot is how you incentivize and compensate people for that participation. This is something that is very, very contentious, actually, that people don't naturally see always that this makes sense. But we believe, again, it's an issue of justice. When you're inviting participation, someone is giving you a gift of their time, which does not come freely. In many cases, actually, people do forsake income-generating activities or other work. So ensuring that they have easy access to that experience and that they find it meaningful work is important, and compensating them is important. And then on the other side of ensuring that participation is actually meaningful and that those in power are listening and are wanting this, I think this gets to those larger trends we keep coming back to around the need for transparency, accountability, and all these grassroots movements that are demanding this all over the world. So plugging into and leveraging those other movements, those social movements that are really holding governments and institutions accountable, those are really powerful tools.
I'd just add also that you always have to consider who's representing the community. And that has to be an iterative process as well, to constantly ask who's not here at the table. So for example, in the Disability Rights Fund, we can only have a limited number of representatives from the disability community at the grant-making committee that is looking at our country's strategies, is making decisions about grants. But one of the ways that we ensure that we have diversity over time is by having term limits. So we have term limits for the people who are there, then we bring in new people. And it's a constantly rotating process, so more and more people can have that experience of being part of the grant-making process and the grants decision-making, the strategy setting. And we also look at, we use a nominations process. So we go to an organization that's global called the International Disability Alliance, which is a membership organization of membership organizations of persons with disabilities. So global organizations like the World Blind Union, World Federation of the Deaf, World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, and others. And then regional organizations, African Disability Forum, the ASEAN Disability Forum, the Latin American network of organizations of persons with disabilities, and they make nominations for the people with disabilities who sit at our table. But as Katy said, sometimes because of the hierarchies of our society, which also are within the disability movement, sometimes the people who are nominated are those cisgender, urban, educated men with physical disabilities or blindness, and others are left out. So we have to make very, very clear the criteria and the characteristics that we are looking for. And if we do not get nominations, then we go out and find people who we can bring in. For example, now on our grant-making committee, a number of the people we have sitting on the grant-making committee include a Peruvian man with psychosocial disability who works for the UN Special Rapporteur on persons with disabilities. So he is an expert in his own right. He's also a person with disability. We have a Kenyan woman with intellectual disability. It's very important to us that we make sure that people are not there as tokens, but that she can fully understand what our meetings are going to be covering, what the information is that she needs to know. So for her, we bring her in advance of our meetings, and she sits with our inclusion and analytics officer, who walks her through what the meeting is going to look like, what's going to happen at every stage of the meeting, where she might want to make an intervention, and helps her in that process so that her voice can be part of that process in that table. And then another person we have on our grant-making committee is a woman with deafblindness from Slovenia. And she has 2 interpreters she brings with her. That's another very important part of this process, is making sure that everybody who is at the table can fully participate in with whatever supports that they need.
I just want to add on to what Diana said. I think the best participatory practice is one that meets folks where they're at. Like that's been key for us at Common Counsel and how we've implemented participatory practices. And I'm reflecting on my time in Boston. I was involved with the initial participatory budgeting practices when organizations wanted to do participatory budgeting within their organization in terms of developing organizational budget, because it was driven by funders. And what we found was actually it was a complete and utter failure, because we said, whole hog, this is you get to decide everything. It's from a cultural standpoint for folks who, and I was a community organizer, so these are low-income, poor communities, people of color communities, and for those communities who have historically not had access to those resources, it's very paralyzing to essentially say, to go from nothing to everything. And so for us, like the way that we engage in participatory practices is understanding where folks are at and then moving folks along incrementally along a phased spectrum of what does participation look like. 1, I saw your hand, and then 3, 4.
Hi, my name is Elise McMahon, and I'm a senior human rights studies major.
Hi.
And I had experience at the Children's Defense Fund this past summer, and we thought a lot about these issues of how to get like the experiences and voices of children involved in the grant-making process and the change-making process. And something that I'm thinking about when listening to you all is like how language plays and like what data is seen as legitimate. How do you get children and families who don't have the grant-making language, who don't have the quantitative data, who have only their experiences in their own like vernacular, how is that seen as legitimate when the change that's made in the House or change, like grants have to have very technical language and very quantitative data? Like how do you change that system?
Do they have to, though? Do they have to have technical language? I don't know. It's a good question.
So I guess I'll start, and love for folks to chime in. But I think for us, the cultural shift that actually has to happen is that for folks who are coming with lived experience, for that to count as expertise, right? Because I think their understanding and their lived experiences dealing with whatever issue it is, that's actually very critical in understanding how to address it. Yeah. That didn't answer your question, but it's a reframe.
Yeah. Our grant-making committee is a combination of donors and persons with disabilities, and it has been from the beginning. While there are majority people with disabilities, we also have our donor representatives on the committee as well. And we set it up that way so that it could be a learning environment in both directions. Because there had been so little interaction, direct interaction between donors and persons with disabilities. So both speaking very different languages. And it has been a learning experience for both the donor representatives and the persons with disabilities. So, you know, what do donors look like? How do they speak? What do they care about in the grant-making decision process? You know, what are they looking at? And on the other hand, well, what are persons with disabilities' priorities? You know, how do they speak, et cetera? So it is a two-way learning, and that's been really helpful.
I think just to say there are foundations out there that are focusing on youth, and there's one recently in a community of practice that we're involved in that is from Poland called the Fem Fund that's being established right now that is for young feminists. There's also the Frida Young Feminist Fund, which is one of the examples we all come back to as a beloved organization doing radical and amazing participatory work. And then there are others around the world too that are prioritizing participation of youth and young people, and how that's defined, of course, varies from place to place, but it is something that we've seen several examples of also, and it's exciting and inspiring. It's just deeply motivating to see these models say, children, of course they can engage in these processes. Youth, of course they have something valuable to offer. Did anyone notice the climate strikes in the last few weeks? Like, these people have so much for us to learn from. So it's exciting to hear about that conversation you were having internally.
There's a question back there.
Yeah, that was actually along the lines of what I was wondering, the extent and challenges of power and participation when it's children's rights. Yeah, so we're sort of asking, I think, similar type questions, so I can pass it on to another person. But that's something that I would like to hear from others if they have had experiences working with that. That would be great.
One thing I could say on that, just to add to this discussion, is that while children often don't have their own organizations, so that becomes a challenge for grant makers to, you know, who do you make a grant to? So for us, we do consider applications from parent organizations, parents of children with disabilities, but we only consider them if they have a self-advocacy component of what they do. So they're building the self-advocacy strength of the children with disabilities themselves.
I think I just was reflecting on the earlier question too around this, and I do think that it's on the foundation and funder sector to challenge ourselves around this jargon. No, I don't think that we need it, and yet we have invented a lot of institutions that, you know, thrive on the jargon, because jargon creates expertise, and there's a whole industry of people who, including myself, who have lived their lives in philanthropy. And so I think it's really, as we think about accessibility and as we think about youth that both of you are bringing up, I think it's really important to say, do we need that jargon? You know, even the terminology, participatory grant making, a word I probably say 50 times a day, I don't love it. My parents don't understand what it means. Grant make, like nobody, they're like, oh, okay, so you raise the money. No, we give away, anyway. It's the whole language and terminology I don't believe is accessible, and that there's a whole piece of work that I think we need to do to ensure that it is accessible. And I really appreciate that provocation. I think also with the youth-specific case studies, again, to refer to the Grantcraft Guide, which has become the sort of seminal piece of work documenting both the why and also the how. And I believe there's at least 1 or 2 case studies in there specifically about youth-focused organizations and work. And the grant craft guide is called Who Decides? Deciding Together.
Deciding Together. Deciding Together.
Deciding Together.
It's
we'll show it on the.
Yeah.
It was co-written, but the primary author is Cindy Gibson.
Yeah. Deciding Together.
Yeah. Before getting to the next question, I wonder if other folks had input on the questions.
The youth, expertise.
I thought that person was raising their hand, but it was actually a camera. Okay. Sorry. No other input into that.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
So my question isn't unrelated to that point, just not about the youth in particular, but I appreciate your comment about the jargon, participatory grant making. When you had your list of reasons for the question, the answers to the question, why participatory grant making now, it struck me that none of those bullet points really were anything new.
No.
We've been living with those for 25 years, so it doesn't really explain why now, per se. Though, after the financial crisis, global financial crisis, we did see a rise in social entrepreneurship. Many young people who were getting out of school found there were no jobs for them. There's no employment, but they were told you can go out and create your own meaningful job if you start your own social enterprise. And it became a way, I think, for grant makers to push towards something new. Was at a time where neoliberalism more generally was being questioned as a sort of disciplinary mechanism for getting NGOs in line, NGOs that have been pushing prior to that for more corporate accountability. And now that impact investors are in a position to dangle the funds necessary for working on various campaigns for change, in exchange, you can talk about participation to some extent, although a nomination process isn't quite the same as having them participate in setting the agenda. Certain issues I can see going forward in that manner and getting promoted through that process. But what about corporate accountability itself? Would that be the kind of issue that you would find funders willing to give lots of money to during this sea change that you see coming in the grant-making world? I talked to Dennis O'Brien, who's the richest man in Ireland and founder of Digicel mobile wallets. And we were at a conference at the World Bank where they brought in the top 100 young entrepreneurs under the age of 30. And I was supposed to judge the social impact components of their enterprises, and he was judging the financial models. And I asked him about the corporate accountability piece, and he said, corporate accountability's dead.
Wow.
Everyone's a social entrepreneur now. And it seemed kind of cynical. But some people think about the social entrepreneurship in that way. They've turned the tables on the NGOs that held corporations accountable before. I wonder where you all fit into this. You said you're a little bit left of mainstream in the granting world, but I wonder where you see that issue in particular.
Well, I don't have experience funding corporate accountability, though I'm for it. I believe strongly in accountability. I believe in being held accountable and in doing my part. I just don't have experience in funding that, and I take your point very well that actually these trends that we beamed up a few slides ago are not new. They're part of a long-standing issue. In fact, even participatory grant making has been documented to be existing since the 60s and the 70s. So it's not new in and of itself either. And I think that it is really hard to know why it's starting to turn now and sort of how philanthropy tends to change. There have been some trends that have taken philanthropy decades to adopt, like funding what we call general operating support. Speaking of jargon, it just means that you give a donation, you give a grant that has no strings attached, that you trust the organization to use those dollars or whatever currency to the best of their ability. It's a trusting relationship. We have so much data that shows us this is a good practice, and yet it's taken philanthropy decades to even be able to start seeing it and highlighting it as a good practice, to be recognized by sector experts and held up as a good practice. Participatory grant making is heading in that direction, undoubtedly so. But we don't have those decades and decades of research and documentation showing that. So there is a fair amount of work being funded right now by the Ford Foundation, again, to show that, to demonstrate that, to build the evidence around it, and to challenge assumptions and document test hypotheses around whether and why it is impactful. So I think that ultimately, this is, if you zoom out, it's big picture, it's something that's been happening for a long time, but it does take decades to see real change in philanthropy. Decades. It's not a short-term game.
There are some actors who are working to bring more accountability into investment, impact investment included. And one example is Transform Finance. They specifically work with investors to bring into the picture community-led investing. So it's a very similar practice, but in the investment sphere. So you might want to take a look at that.
Yeah, I'll say in terms of that impact investing so Transform Finance essentially has non-extractive investment principles. And what you'll see actually in the conversions from corporations into B Corps or other type of social enterprises is actually as small ones that actually have values alignment already that are best suited to become social enterprises in the way that you're defining social enterprises. I had a point around what you were going to say, but I forgot it.
It'll come back.
And then question was here.
Thank you. I really admire what you're doing with the participatory practices, and I think it's absolutely necessary and transforms, I think, the way a lot of these philanthropic grant making can be done. And I'm wondering if we're talking about, there's been a lot of talk about justice, not charity, and these sort of the touching on inequality. And if I could just pull back the lens a little bit, I've never been a part of a philanthropic organization. I teach philosophy, so I'm going to step back on the lens and I'm curious. While I realize the absolute urgency and importance of the work being done, because it's helping people, and especially one of the problems I think with human rights is its need to respond to suffering, right, and the oppressed. But what I wonder is if the philanthropic paradigm isn't caught within a structure that resists change, right? I think it's needed within the present system, right? I mean, obviously, people need the assistance immediately. But I wonder if it also has limitations of actually transforming from charity to justice. And that's always my concern in these. So I just, since you have experience in this, what your lens?
I feel like that's,
Go ahead.
I feel like that's spot on. One of the questions that we were going to try and ask was, is participatory grant making, participatory practices, is that enough to change inequality? What I'll say is that I think, and this ties into the last question as well, but I feel like there's a lot of organizations that are in this space of let's transition the organizations or systems that are currently in place, let's transition them to be a little bit more participatory, a lot more justice-centered. And there's folks on the complete opposite side that are essentially trying to build new institutions that are outside of the scope of this. And so like, I would think of like Mondragon as an example of like, where participatory budgeting has really taken, or where participatory practices have really taken hold. And so I feel like and going back to the question about social enterprise, I feel like a lot of it's driven by like, what is of interest to folks? Like, is there interest in stopping and changing a system, which actually is very hard to change? Or is your energy driven by building something new that's, many would say is like visionary, I guess, is how folks usually frame it. But I would just say, great question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us believe that this is enough. This is a step in the right direction, but what we truly want is revolution.
Well, I assume many of you saw Opal Tometi speak 2 nights ago now. And one of the things that I found so inspiring that she said is that we need both. We need to tinker within the system. We need to continue to fight for lowercase j justice, to quote Opal. But we need to also look at the big picture and radically redesign the world we want to live in. And I think that's how we feel about participatory grant making. We completely agree with your points that this is more about tinkering around the edges, trying to make the most of the capitalist society that we live in, which is predicated on inequality. So ultimately, if we do want to move into the world that at least the three of us would like to see, philanthropy may or may not be a part of that at all. We're a long ways from that right now, though.
Tax reform.
Yes. If anyone's a tax professor out there, we'd really like to learn more.
Without the economics.
Other questions?
My experience working in the Congo, at some point I even started thinking that maybe we should just stop literally with philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't dare say that because I can be killed because it's a lot of money coming in the country throughout many international NGO. But after many years, that money coming in, I can tell you there is no change.
Mm-hmm.
And I was working in local community, based, and I can see how even harming the money is becoming. Because even people who could work, just work, because they believe that community needs change, they are not working anymore because they expect to be paid. Because international NGO bring up a lot of money, and those who work with those NGO actually have great cars, beautiful houses, because they have to be paid to do the job. So the people in the community are seeing that. So now to make them work just because they believe in positive change, that's because the community needs it, it's become very complicated. So they need to be paid for that. So that's the kind of reflection I'm doing. So I don't want to say, okay, stop with the money totally, because I think we do need money. But how do we deal with those challenges? They are real challenges.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You are right.
Like for us at our Native Voices Rising, our Native organizations have historically not received funding, and so really operate outside of operating with capital and financial resources. And so I feel like it's a very similar analogy in terms of actually going back to the last question, where folks have to actually understand what is it that we're doing incrementally towards, in this case, moving with the money, and what is the other system that we want to build together.
Yeah, the Disability Rights Fund funds local organizations of people with disabilities, so it's not, it's a different system than an INGO coming in, because these are Native organizations made of local people. But I take your point that money changes people, money changes relationships, and it is tough. How do you handle that? And I think there are a lot of issues. As we've all said, it's an iterative process. You have to keep pointing out the inequalities. You have to keep bringing in people who aren't there. You have to keep having discussions about why there are hierarchies, why there is a push towards inequality. And it's not easy. It's not easy.
But it's important to interrogate that. And so long as the system exists, I think it's really important to ask those questions. And one book, well, we know that the keynote speaker tonight will be speaking about some of these critical issues and in a very engaging way. There's also other books that have come out recently by Rob Reich about the critiques of the philanthro-industrial complex, if you will, as well as Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, which is another really important read for, I mean, basically anyone who's ever had money ever. It's a really great one. And then there are other books as well. And in fact, when we talk about the moment that we're in, actually, within the past 2 years, there have been some amazing treatises written about philanthropy by men, I'll note, 4 or 5 of them that have gotten a lot of attention, that are creating public dialogue. And it's interesting why that's happening now. It's really interesting to see these books getting mainstream attention. You know, they're written in major publications. They're addressing, you know, broad human rights conferences, not just the niche industry of philanthropy. So change is afoot. We can feel it. We can feel it.
That's a great segue into our closing. So were there who wants to start the last words?
Well, I think I already probably said these words before, but I just wanted to close by saying that participatory grant making, or any participatory process really, including deliberative democracy, is a commitment to ongoing dialogue, to change, to learning, to flexibility, to listening. We've talked about it, as I said, as an infinity loop. In its essence, you know, this is what we call, or what should be understood as democracy, right?
I'll go so Katy can have the last word. I think that you all are doing, or at least for folks who spoke and asked questions, I feel like that's what we need. We need folks to start asking questions, to actually question the systems and structures that are in place and traditional structures, so we can move towards both this system of, or changing the current system, but then also trying to envision what is possible without the current boundaries set upon us.
That's great. I think my last words would really be about power and thinking about the power each of us holds as individuals, the power the institutions we sit in come from, and really interrogating that. What does it mean? How did we get it? How can we change that? That's ultimately, I think, what drives us, probably a lot of us in this room, to continue to do the work, is ultimately to shift power.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. And Diana has left some resources about the Disability Rights Fund on some oddly placed chairs. Some have it, some don't.
Yeah. And come tonight to hear Anand Giridharadas speak on this similar topic.
Thank you all.